My name is Joel Back, and I am the co-creator with Mark Akbar of the Corporation documentary. I'm also the author of the book that the film is based on. So it's interesting, I mean, that the film being based on the book. I actually wrote the book and the film. I'm the writer of the film as well. I wrote the book and the film at the same time, and the way that this project came together was kind of interesting. I met Mark Akbar at a funeral, actually, of a mutual friend, but Mark and I had never met, and we started talking about our work, and I was at that time thinking about doing a book on the corporation and also more generally issues about law and the economy and this sort of thing, an academic book, as I'm a law professor, so normally I write academic books. But we began talking, and he thought the ideas were interesting, and he told me he was thinking of doing film on globalization, and we realized that our interests were quite similar, and so we started emailing back and forth and decided that we'd collaborate on the film, and that I would write the film and I would write the book at the same time, and that was about 7 years ago, back in 1997, and that's what happened. One of the reasons back in the mid-1990s I thought it was important to do this kind of project, to at that time to write a book and then later to make a film about the corporation, and a book and a film that would reach a wide audience, was that it seemed to me there was this strange gap that was developing. On the one hand, the corporation was emerging at that time as probably the most influential, powerful institution in the world, even becoming more powerful than government. It was truly emerging as a dominant institution in the world. At the same time, it seemed to me people knew very little about it. Normally, we know about our governing institutions. We're supposed to understand how they work, how they're put together. And yet it seemed to me that the corporation, while emerging as truly a governing institution in the world, people really didn't know anything about how it's put together, what makes it tick. Most of our knowledge is about this or that corporation, what it makes, how it acts, but we never really see the corporation as an institution. So it seemed important to me to do a work that would actually look at the corporation as an institution, look at what all corporations have in common, at least all publicly traded corporations, what they have in common as institutions, especially because the corporation is such a strange institution, a quite bizarre institution, and potentially a very dangerous one.
The picture's incomplete, but equally, if it's the only path, it's not going to work.
A sports team. Some of us are blocking and tackling, some of us are running the ball, some of us are throwing the ball, but we all have a common...
So at the very beginning of the film, we go through this, these different metaphors that people have come up with, which are then graphically illustrated with archive and whatnot. Different metaphors about what people think the corporation is. And one of the purposes of having that right at the outset is to get audience members thinking in terms of the corporation as an institution. Again, breaking out of the usual mold of being concerned with this or that corporation, and actually getting people to engage the idea and familiarize themselves with this notion that there is actually this common institutional structure that people can talk intelligibly about, which they do at the beginning of the film.
I could see that being a good logo for the principal.
This scene with Ira Jackson where, he says, "Okay, enough bullshit." That was quite interesting. I wasn't at that interview, but there was a lot of back and forth among us about, whether that should be included, whether he thought the interview was over, and that the tape wasn't rolling anymore. And I think ultimately we concluded that it was he who was sort of getting up and walking away. He would have been aware that the tape was still rolling, but then I guess in the end of 2003, I screened the film at Harvard University, and Ira Jackson came to the film. And he left the film early, and I was kind of curious. I thought, well, you know, maybe he was a little bit miffed about being included in that way. And so I walked out into the hallway, out of the room where it was being screened, and saw that he was going into the men's room. So I followed him into the men's room, and fortunately there were 2 urinals, so I could pull in beside him, and just said, so, you know, what do you think? And he said, boy, I don't remember like why I said that, or he seemed a bit confused about it, and so I asked him, well, why he was leaving early, and he said, oh, actually he had some other obligations and stuff like that. And I did point out to him that he appeared several times later in the film talking seriously about serious things, and I guess I think he was a little bit disturbed, but not a lot disturbed by it. At least that was my sense on this relatively quick encounter at the urinals.
So pointedly, to say what I think a corporation is.
It is one form of business ownership.
It's a group of individuals working together to serve a variety of objectives, the principal one of which is earning large.
You know, again, a lot of the stuff at the beginning of the film where we're asking what a corporation is, as Joe Baderico says, you know, I've never been asked so sort of forthrightly what a corporation is, and I think that most people don't think about what a corporation is, and so really at the beginning of the film it is an attempt to get people thinking about the corporation rather than this or that corporation, because that really is I think our unique contribution in this film and our focus in this film.
Hauling buckets of water out of the mine. It was all about productivity, more coal per man hour. That was the dawn of the industrial age, and then it became more steel per man hour, more textiles per man hour, more automobiles per man hour, and today it's more chips per man hour, more gizmos per man hour. The system is basically the same, producing more sophisticated products today.
The dominant role of corporations in our lives.
I think the point that Noam Chomsky makes about the corporation and the dominant role that corporations play being a relatively recent phenomenon, a product of the last century. This is true. There simply weren't large corporations prior to the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. The rise of the large corporation is really a consequence of industrialization going into high gear, particularly the development of the railroads. Once you have the steam engine and once you have the capacity to create very large industrial projects, whether it be railroads or steamship lines or large factories, you need to raise a lot of money to be able to finance these projects. And prior to that time, the late 19th century, most of the enterprises and businesses were relatively small. You know, you'd have a mill on a river or whatever. And the partnership really was the dominant form of business undertaking then. The problem with the partnership, though, is that it was limited in terms of how many people could invest in a firm. Basically, in a partnership, the same people who owned the firm also ran the firm. There wasn't any split between the owners and the managers. In practical terms, maybe you could have 100 people, maybe 200 people as a member of a partnership, but that limited you to those 100 or 200 people in terms of potential investors. The genius of the corporation is that it split the ownership of a firm from the management of a firm. So there could be potentially thousands, even millions of owners, each having a small share or a number of small shares of the firm, and then they would hire managers to run the firm. And so with the corporation, you had a device that enabled you to create huge pools of investment capital to tap potentially an infinite number of individuals for small and large amounts of capital and raise the millions and billions of dollars that were necessary to create the kinds of things you can now create with the steam engine, with industrialization, like railroads, like steamship companies, like large factories, and so you really don't get all of that coming into place until the late 19th century. So while today it seems as though corporate capitalism, I mean, has always been and will always be, I think it's a quite destabilizing notion to think that it's actually a bit of a flash in the pan, that in the whole history of the world, it's only in the last 100 years that we've had anything that at all even resembled the system that we have today.
600,000 people were killed to get rights for people. And then with strokes of the pen over the next 30 years, judges applied those rights to capital and property while stripping them.
One of the things that I sometimes have some difficulty with the film is the fact that the discussion of origins of the corporation tends to be primarily about the United States, about the origins of the corporation in the United States. And so you hear the story about the Santa Clara case and how that, in that case, the Supreme Court in the United States recognized corporations as persons and gave them constitutional rights under the 14th Amendment as persons. The difficulty with that is it suggests, and the way we treat it in the film, I think, may lend to the suggestion that this is a uniquely American phenomenon, and that the Santa Clara case actually is what gave personhood to corporations. And neither of those is true. What the Santa Clara case did, and there's a fantastic piece by a former professor of mine at Harvard, actually named Morton Horowitz, called Santa Clara Revisited, and he makes this point. It didn't confer personhood on corporations. It simply recognized that corporations as persons could have rights under the Bill of Rights in the United States. The notion of personhood actually goes back a lot further than this late 19th century case, Santa Clara. And it's actually much more general and extends to corporations well beyond the American system and the British system and the Canadian system. Corporations are recognized as persons in the European system as well. And the basic idea of personhood is that if, in fact, you create a separate entity from the actual people who own a corporation and who constitute a corporation, the shareholders, that entity has to have some status at law. One of the whole purposes of the corporation is to attract investment capital from people who aren't involved in the running of the corporation. Well, most people are not going to put money into an entity that they have no part in running, and without some guarantee that if things go wrong, if the entity goes bankrupt or whatever, they won't be personally liable. So what the corporation does is it creates this concept of limited liability. The people who own the company are not legally liable for things that go wrong with the company. Well, if that's the case, if they're not legally liable, who is legally liable when things go wrong? And that's where you create this strange notion, it's kind of a legal alchemy, where the entity itself, the corporation, as separate from the actual people who own it, becomes the holder of legal responsibilities and of legal rights. And the thing about law is law only confers rights and obligations on people. You know, rocks and trees and dogs and cats don't have any rights or obligations in the legal system. You have to be a person. So the trick was to say, well, what we'll do with this entity that's going to be operating in the economy and that has to have legal rights and legal obligations is we'll just deem it to be a person. And courts began to do that as early as the 16th century, and they actually drew on earlier notions from Roman law to develop this concept so that they could completely separate out the owners of the company and the shareholders of the company could just be sort of invisible in effect and be shielded from any kind of liability for things that went wrong, and turn this artificial entity, the corporation, into a person for the purposes of the law.
Services and goods that are of value to all of us, that make our lives better,
and that's a good thing. The problem comes in the profit motivation here, because these people, there's no such thing as enough.
And I always point out there's no organization on this planet that can neglect its economic foundation. Even someone, living under a banyan tree is dependent on support from someone. The economic leg has to be addressed by everyone. It's not just a business issue.
But, unlike someone under a banyan tree, all publicly traded corporations have been structured through a series of legal decisions to have a peculiar and disturbing characteristic. They are required, by law, to place a financial interest.
And that, for me, that legal principle that the corporation always has to place the financial interests of its owners above all other interests, including the public interest, that really is the nub of this whole project. For me, as a law student, learning about the corporation, and then later as a law professor teaching about the corporation, I was always struck by this idea that we as a society have created an institution that is, and given it a huge amount of power over our lives, and yet it is incapable of acting out of anything but its own interests and concerns, namely the interests, the financial interests and concerns of the people who own it, the shareholders. And that struck me as a very dangerous thing, and a unique thing. I mean, if you look through world history, most dominant institutions throughout history have at least the pretense of being concerned in some way about some public interest. I mean, even the most horrific regimes in history would say, and needless to say, not very believably, but would say, we're concerned about the interests of the people. The thing about the corporation, it is deliberately put together in a way that it legally cannot be concerned about the interests of anything, anybody, or anything other than making money for its owners. And it seems to me there may be a place for that in this world, but what we've done is we've given it much too large a place. We've enabled this self-serving entity to become very large, to become very influential, to grow to the point where it's actually dominating the governments that we elect and that supposedly represent us, and yet it's incapable of being concerned about, of serving any kind of public interest, any interest but the private financial interests of its shareholders. That always struck me as bizarre and as a very serious indictment of our supposed civilization. And really that was a fundamental motivating factor behind this whole project for me.
Will. The enterprise has within it, and the shark has within it, those characteristics that enable it to do that for which it was designed.
So the pressure's on the corporation to deliver results now and to externalize any cost that this unwary or uncaring public will allow it to externalize.